The transport shuttle shook violently as it entered the atmosphere of Kavros. Tom Bradley gripped his seat and watched the other passengers through the corner of his eye. Most of them looked calm, almost bored, the tall crystal being sitting. Across from him was actually glowing softly, probably absorbing energy from the ship's lighting. The metal-skinned creature next to the window was casually bending a steel bar between its fingers like it was made of clay. Tom felt very ordinary. Compared to these aliens, he was just a human engineer from one of Earth's newer colonies. His hands were calloused from years of working with machinery, and his brown hair was already getting gray at 35. Nothing special about him at all. He wondered again why. Earth's colonial fleet had chosen him for this program. The Galactic Survival Institute was famous across 12 different star systems. Only the best candidates from each species were invited to attend. Tom had heard the stories about how tough the training was. Many beings who entered never completed the program. Some didn't make it home at all. The shuttle landed with a heavy thud on a metal platform. Through the small window, Tom could see a massive complex of buildings built into the side of a mountain. The architecture looked alien and harsh, all sharp, angles and dark metal. This was definitely not going to be comfortable. A voice boomed over the shuttle's speaker system. "All trainees will exit immediately. Bring nothing except the clothes you are wearing. Move quickly." Tom followed the other beings off the shuttle. The air on Kavros was thin and cold, making him shiver immediately. The gravity felt heavier than Earth normal, and each step took extra effort. Around him, creatures of all shapes and sizes were looking around with various expressions of curiosity or concern. The crystal being from his shuttle was now clearly visible in the daylight. It stood nearly 8 feet tall and looked like it was made of living diamond. Light seemed to flow through its body in beautiful patterns. A few feet away, the metal creature was flexing its arms, and Tom could hear the sound of metal grinding. "Against metal!" "Welcome to hell," said a voice behind him. Tom turned to see another creature that looked somewhat like a large insect, but walking upright on 2 legs. Its voice came through a small translator device. "I am Crix from the Trilaxon Systems. This is my 3rd attempt at the program." "Third attempt?" Tom asked. "What happened the first 2 times?" Crix made a sound that might have been laughter. "Failure. Complete and total failure. But my species does not give up easily. We adapt, we phase, we survive." The creature's body seemed to flicker slightly, becoming translucent for a moment before returning to normal. Before Tom could respond, a sound like thunder echoed across the landing platform. All conversation stopped. Every being turned toward the source of the noise. Drill Commander Vorth was walking toward them, and he was the most intimidating creature Tom had ever seen. The alien stood at least 10 feet tall, with thick reptilian skin that was dark green and covered in scars. But what made him truly terrifying were his 6 arms. Each one was thick with muscle and ended in claws that looked sharp enough to cut through steel. His eyes were bright yellow and seemed to look right through each trainee as he passed. "Listen carefully," Vorth's voice boomed across the platform without any need for amplification. "You are here because your species believes you are strong. You are here because someone thinks you have what it takes to survive in the worst conditions the galaxy can offer. Most of you are wrong." He stopped in front of the group and let his gaze move slowly from one trainee to another. When his eyes met Tom's, the human felt like the alien could see every weakness, every doubt, every fear he had ever experienced. "This is the Galactic Survival Institute," Vorth continued. "For the next 6 weeks, you will be pushed beyond every limit you thought you had. You will be hungry. You will be cold. You will be afraid. Some of you will quit. Some of you will be carried out. A very few of you might actually learn something." One of the trainees, a creature that looked like it was made of flowing liquid, metal, raised what might have been a hand. "Commander, what exactly will we be learning?" Vorth's mouth opened in what Tom realized was probably a smile, showing rows of sharp teeth. You will learn that technology makes you weak. You will learn that comfort makes you soft. You will learn that when everything is stripped away, only the truly strong survive. He began walking among the group, his claws clicking on the metal platform. Each of you comes from a species that has mastered some aspect of survival. The Halians absorb energy directly from light sources. The Korans can reshape metal with their bare hands. The Trilaxans can phase through solid matter. Very impressive abilities. Vorth stopped directly in front of Tom. And then we have the humans. Tell me, human, what special ability does your species possess? Tom felt every eye in the group turn toward him. His mouth went dry, but he managed to speak. We adapt, Commander. We learn. We make tools. Tools. Vorth repeated the word like it was something distasteful. Yes, humans are known for their tools. Always building something, always making something, always depending on something other than themselves. He leaned down until his face was inches from Tom's. What happens when there are no tools, human? Tom met the alien's gaze steadily. Then, we make new ones, sir. For a moment, Vorth stared at him without speaking. Then he straightened up and addressed the entire group again. Follow me. Your real education begins now. The group followed the commander toward the building complex. As they walked, Tom noticed that the other trainees were keeping their distance from him. He had marked himself as different with his answer. And in a place like this, being different might not be safe. The massive doors of the Institute opened before them, revealing corridors that seemed to stretch on forever. Tom took a deep breath of the cold air and stepped inside. Whatever was waiting for him in there, he would face it the way humans always had. He would adapt. He would learn. And if necessary, he would make whatever tools he needed to survive. Behind them. The shuttle was already lifting off, carrying away their last connection to the familiar world they had known. There was no going back now. 6 weeks had passed like a nightmare that refused to end. Tom's hands were covered in cuts and calluses from the endless training exercises. His clothes were torn and dirty, and he had lost at least 20 pounds from the strict food rationing. But he was still here, still standing, still breathing. The dormitory was quiet except for the soft sounds of exhausted beings trying to sleep. Of the 43 trainees who had started the program, only 19 remained. Some had quit during the first week when they realized how brutal the training would be. Others had been removed after injuries or complete mental breakdowns. A few had simply disappeared one night, and no one talked about where they had gone. Tom rolled over on his thin sleeping mat and looked at the other survivors. Crix the Trilaxan was still there, somehow managing to succeed on his third attempt. The crystal being, who had told them his name was Luz, was glowing faintly in the darkness as he recharged himself. Near the window, a Koran female named Dira was unconsciously shaping small pieces of metal in her sleep, her fingers working constantly, even when she was unconscious. The training had been everything Vorth had promised, and worse. They had been forced to climb impossible cliffs without safety equipment. They had spent days without food, learning to find nutrition in things that barely qualified as edible. They had been dropped in freezing water and told to swim to shore, or drown. Each exercise was designed to push them past what their species normally considered possible. But Tom had noticed something interesting during those 6 weeks. When the exercises got really difficult, when the other trainees started to panic or give up, he found himself getting calmer and more focused. The worse things became, the more his mind seemed to sharpen and look for solutions. It was like his brain was built for problems that seemed impossible to solve. The door to the dormitory crashed open, and bright lights flooded the room. Vorth's voice boomed through the space. "Everyone up! Now! Move!" The trainees scrambled to their feet, knowing better than to hesitate when the commander gave an order. Tom pulled on his boots quickly and stood at attention with the others. Vorth entered the room with several other instructors behind him. "Today you face your final examination," Vorth announced. His yellow eyes gleamed with something that might have been anticipation. "Everything you have learned, everything you have suffered through, has been preparation for this moment." He activated a holographic display that showed a three-dimensional map of a mountainous region. The terrain looked harsh and unforgiving, with steep cliffs, deep valleys, and areas marked in red that Tom assumed were danger zones. "This is Sector 7 of Kavros," Vorth continued. "It is the most hostile environment on this planet. The temperature drops below freezing every night. Acid rain falls regularly. The local predators are hungry and aggressive. The rock is harder than most metal alloys." Crix raised a trembling hand. "Commander, what exactly is our mission in this place?" Vorth's smile showed all of his sharp teeth. "Survival. Each of you will be transported to a different location in Sector 7. You will have 7 days to accomplish 3 tasks. First, you must build a shelter that will protect you from the environment. Second, you must find a sustainable source of food and water. Third, you must create a signal that will allow our extraction team to locate you." The holographic display zoomed in on different areas of the region. Tom could see that it was even worse than Vorth had described. The cliffs looked like they were made of solid granite, rising hundreds of feet into the sky. The valleys were filled with strange vegetation that had an unhealthy purple color. Strange creatures moved through the display, things with too many teeth and claws. "Commander," Dira the Koran spoke up, "what equipment will we be provided for this exercise?" Vorth's laugh was like the sound of grinding stone. "Equipment? You misunderstand the purpose of this test." He gestured to one of the other instructors, who brought forward a small box. From the box, Vorth removed a simple river stone, smooth and gray and about the size of his palm. "This is the limit of your technology," he said, holding up the stone. "No manufactured tools, no worked metal, no carved implements, no devices of any kind. You may use only what you can gather with your bare hands in the environment where you are placed." The silence in the dormitory was complete. Tom could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. Around him, the other trainees were staring at Vorth in shock and growing fear. Luz the crystal being was the first to speak. "That is impossible, Commander. Without proper equipment, without tools, we cannot possibly accomplish these tasks." "The Korans need metal to work with," Dira added desperately. "Without forged tools, our abilities are useless. I cannot phase through solid matter without proper anchor points," Crix said. "My species requires prepared surfaces to use our abilities effectively." Other voices joined the protest. Each trainee began explaining why their particular species could not possibly succeed under these conditions. The room filled with worried chatter and growing panic. Tom remained silent, staring at the riverstone in Vorth's hand. His mind was already working, already analyzing the problem from different angles. He thought about the granite cliffs in the holographic display. He thought about the properties of different types of stone. He thought about techniques that humans had used thousands of years ago before they had learned to work with metals. Vorth raised one of his hands for silence. "I see that most of you believe this task is impossible. Good. That means you are finally beginning to understand what real survival means. When your ship crashes on an unknown planet, there will be no rescue team coming to save you. When your colony is attacked and your equipment is destroyed, you will have only your hands and your mind to keep you alive." He walked slowly through the group, looking at each trainee. Soft species rely on tools. They become dependent on technology. They forget that their ancestors survived for millions of years with nothing but stones and sticks and the intelligence to use them properly. When he reached Tom, Vorth stopped. "What do you think, human? Is this task impossible?" Tom looked up at the towering alien commander. "No, sir. Difficult but not impossible." "Explain." Tom pointed at the holographic display. Stone can be shaped by other stones if you understand the principles involved. Granite has natural fracture lines that can be exploited. Fire can be made without matches. Water can be purified without filters. Shelter can be carved if you have the patience and knowledge to do it properly. Vorth studied him for a long moment. We shall see, human. We shall see if your confidence is justified, or if you are simply too ignorant to understand how impossible this task really is. The commander addressed the entire group again. You have 1 hour to prepare yourselves mentally for transport. Eat well, because it may be your last meal for 7 days. Rest, because you will need every bit of strength you possess. And remember, only the truly strong will survive what is coming. As the instructors filed out of the dormitory, the other trainees began talking frantically among themselves, sharing fears and desperate plans. Tom sat down on his sleeping mat and picked up a small piece of metal that had fallen from Dira's work. He held it in his hands and thought about the riverstone Vorth had shown them. In 1 hour, he would be dropped alone in the most hostile place on this planet, with nothing but the clothes on his back and whatever he could pick up with his hands. Most of the other trainees would probably not survive, but Tom felt something he had not expected to feel. He felt ready. The morning air cut through Tom's clothes like ice as he stood alone on a narrow ledge halfway up a granite cliff. The transport shuttle had already disappeared over the horizon, leaving him completely isolated in this hostile wilderness. Below him stretched a valley filled with strange purple vegetation. Above him rose another 200 feet of solid rock face. He had chosen this location carefully during the brief flight over Sector 7. While the other trainees had been dropped in valleys or on flat ground, Tom had asked the pilot to leave him, here on this ledge. The other passengers had looked at him like he was crazy. Maybe they were right. Tom pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders and began examining the rock face around him. The granite was exactly what he had hoped to find. It was hard and dense, but he could see the natural fracture lines running through it in predictable patterns. More importantly, he could see darker veins of different minerals running through the granite like roads on a map. His first priority was tools. Without tools, everything else would be impossible. Tom began walking along the ledge looking for the right type of stone to begin with. Most humans forgot that their ancestors had been master tool makers long before they discovered metals. They had shaped stone with stone, created cutting edges sharper than modern knives, and built structures. That lasted for thousands of years. Near the end of the ledge, Tom found what he was looking for. A piece of granite had broken away from the cliff face and was lying among several smaller rocks. He picked up the largest piece and hefted it in his hands. It was about the size of a football and weighed maybe 10 pounds. Perfect for his first hammerstone. He selected a smaller, harder piece of rock to use as his striker. Then he began the slow, patient process of shaping his first tool. The technique was called knapping, and it required understanding exactly how different types of stone would break when struck from specific angles. Tom held the larger stone steady and began striking it with precise, controlled blows. Each impact sent small chips flying and slowly shaped the granite into the form he needed. Other trainees would probably think this was a waste of time, but Tom knew that good tools were the foundation of everything that would follow. After 2 hours of careful work, he had created his first crude hand axe. The edge was sharp, and the weight was balanced properly in his grip. Tom tested it against a smaller rock and smiled as it split cleanly in two. Now he could begin making other tools. The sun climbed higher in the sky as Tom continued his work. Using his hand axe, he began shaping other pieces of stone into specialized tools. A hammerstone for heavy pounding, a scraper with a sharp edge for cutting, a boring tool with a pointed tip for making holes. Each one took time and patience, but each one would make the next task easier. By midday, Tom had a basic toolkit spread out on the ledge beside him. His hands were bloody and raw from gripping the rough stones, but he barely noticed the pain. This was the most focused he had felt in years. Every problem had a solution if you approached it with the right knowledge and the right tools. Now came the real test. Tom moved to the cliff face and began examining it more closely. The granite was incredibly hard, much harder than the limestone caves that ancient humans had lived in. But granite had weaknesses if you knew how to find them. The key was understanding the geology, understanding how the rock had been formed, and where the stress points were located. Tom found a natural crack in the cliff face and began working on it with his boring tool. The progress was incredibly slow. Each strike removed only tiny chips of stone. But gradually, very gradually, the crack began to widen and deepen. Other sounds echoed across the valley as Tom worked. He could hear explosions and crashes from the locations where other trainees had been dropped. Someone was apparently trying to blast their way through problems using their natural abilities. Tom wondered how that was working out for them. As the afternoon wore on, Tom developed a rhythm with his work. Strike, clear away the debris, examine the crack, strike again. His boring tool wore down from the constant impact, so he took breaks to resharpen it or create new ones when necessary. The pile of stone chips at his feet grew larger. By evening, Tom had managed to excavate a depression in the cliff face about 3 feet wide and 2 feet deep. It was not much, but it was progress. More importantly, he had learned valuable information about this particular section of granite. The rock was harder than he had expected, but there were veins of softer mineral deposits running through it that could be exploited. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Tom built a small fire using flint he had discovered mixed in with the granite. The technique was simple, but required patience. Strike the flint against steel-hard stone to create sparks, catch the sparks in dry tinder, and carefully nurture the flame until it was strong enough to ignite larger fuel. The fire provided warmth and light, but more importantly, it gave Tom an idea. Heat could change the properties of stone. If he could heat sections of the granite and then cool them rapidly, thermal shock might create fractures that would make his excavation work much easier. Tom spent the first night gathering fuel for larger fires and preparing his workspace. He had no blankets, no shelter except for the small depression he had carved, and no food except for some edible roots he had found growing in cracks in the cliff face. But he had a plan, and that was more than most of the other trainees probably had. The second day began before dawn. Tom built a large fire directly against the cliff face, heating a section of granite until it was almost too hot to touch. Then he threw containers of water against the heated stone, causing rapid cooling and thermal shock. The granite cracked with sounds like gunshots. Now his stone tools could work much more effectively. The thermally weakened granite chipped away in larger pieces, allowing Tom to deepen and widen his excavation much faster than the day before. By noon, he had carved a space large enough for him to sit inside completely out of the wind. But Tom was not satisfied with just a simple cave. He had bigger plans. Using his growing collection of specialized stone tools, he began creating a more sophisticated shelter. He carved drainage channels to direct water away from the entrance. He created ventilation shafts to provide fresh air. He even began working on separate chambers for different purposes. The work was exhausting. Tom's hands were now more cut than not, and every muscle in his body ached from the constant pounding and chipping. But he could see his progress every hour. The space inside the cliff was growing larger and more complex with each passing day. On the third day, other trainees began to visit his location. Word had apparently spread that the human was doing something unusual. Crix the Trilaxan was the first to arrive, looking exhausted and desperate. "How?" Crix asked simply, staring at the carved opening in the cliff face. Tom showed him the collection of stone tools he had created. "My species learned to do this a long time ago. Before we had metals, before we had machines, we learned to shape stone with stone. Dira the Koran arrived later that day, shivering with cold and looking hungry. Her metal-shaping abilities had proven useless without refined metals to work with. Tom shared some of the roots and berries he had found and showed her how to use stone tools to gather more food efficiently. By the end of the fourth day, Tom had created something that was beginning to look less like a cave and more like an underground house. He had multiple rooms carved into the cliff, each designed for a specific purpose. A sleeping chamber that stayed warm, a storage area that remained cool and dry, a workshop where he continued to make and improve his tools. The other trainees who visited were amazed, but Tom knew he was just getting started. He had 3 more days to complete his shelter, and he had ideas for improvements that would make it truly impressive. The key was patience, planning, and understanding that even the hardest problems could be solved if you broke them down into smaller, manageable pieces. As the sun set on the 4th day, Tom sat in his carved shelter and examined his bloody hands by firelight. Tomorrow he would continue expanding and improving his underground home. And if his plans worked correctly, by the end of the 7 days he would have created something that would change how the Galactic Survival Institute thought about primitive technology. Rain hammered against the granite cliff face like bullets from an automatic weapon. The acid in the water made it burn where it touched exposed skin, and the wind drove it horizontally across the mountainside. Any being caught outside in this storm would be in serious danger. Tom sat comfortably in his carved shelter, completely dry and warm. The drainage system he had built was working perfectly, channeling the deadly rain away from his living space and into collection basins where it could be neutralized and purified for drinking. The ventilation shafts he had carved drew fresh air through the complex while venting smoke from his fire through a separate chimney system. It was the 5th day of the test, and Tom's underground home had grown into something remarkable. What had started as a simple cave was now a multi-room complex with sophisticated engineering. He had sleeping quarters with raised sleeping platforms to stay off the cold stone floor. He had storage chambers with different temperature zones for preserving different types of food. He had a workshop area where he continued to refine and improve his growing collection of stone tools. But the most impressive feature was something Tom had just completed that morning. Using careful calculations about water pressure and flow rates, he had carved a complete plumbing system. Fresh water flowed in through carved channels from a spring he had located higher up the cliff. Wastewater flowed out through different channels that carried it safely away from his living area. It was primitive compared to modern plumbing, but it worked perfectly and had been carved using nothing but stone tools and patience. The storm outside began to weaken, and Tom heard voices approaching his shelter. Through the entrance, he could see several of his fellow trainees struggling through the rain and wind. Crix was supporting Luce, whose crystal body was flickering weakly. Dira looked exhausted and was shivering uncontrollably despite her thick metal skin. "Tom!" Crix called out desperately. "We need help! Luz is dying!" Tom immediately went to assist them. He helped carry Luce into the main chamber of his shelter, where the temperature was warm and stable. The crystal being's body was cracked in several places, and his internal light was very dim. "What happened?" Tom asked, examining Luz's injuries. "The acid rain," Dira explained through chattering teeth. "It started dissolving his crystal structure. We tried to find shelter, but everything we built fell apart in the storm." Tom nodded and began working quickly. He had prepared for this kind of emergency. In one of his storage chambers, he had collected various minerals and compounds that he had found throughout the region. Using his knowledge of chemistry and geology, he began preparing a solution that would neutralize the acid damage and help Luce's body repair itself. While Tom worked on helping Luce, the other trainees looked around his shelter in amazement. The walls were not just carved smooth, they were decorated with detailed pictures showing the construction process. Tom had used different colored stones and minerals to create a complete visual guide to his engineering techniques. "This is impossible," Dira whispered, running her metal fingers along the smooth walls. "How did you carve all of this using only stones?" Tom mixed his healing solution and carefully applied it to Luce's damaged areas. "The same way my ancestors built stone cities and temples that lasted for thousands of years. You just have to understand the materials you are working with and have enough patience to do the job properly." Crix was examining the plumbing system, watching clean water flow steadily from the carved channels. "Your species did this before they had metal tools." "Long before," Tom confirmed, checking on Luz's condition. The crystal being's internal light was already getting brighter as the healing solution did its work. Humans built massive stone structures, carved entire cities out of cliff faces, and created water systems that served thousands of people, all with stone tools and human labor. As the storm finally ended and the sun began to set, more trainees arrived at Tom's shelter. Word had spread throughout Sector 7 that the human had created something extraordinary. Beings who had been struggling to survive for 5 days found themselves in a warm, dry, comfortable space that had every amenity they needed. Tom shared his food stores and clean water with everyone who came seeking help. His preservation techniques had allowed him to accumulate far more supplies than he needed for himself. The storage chambers maintained perfect temperatures for keeping meat, vegetables, and other foods fresh and safe to eat. But what impressed the visitors most was not just what Tom had built, but how he had documented everything he had done. The wall paintings showed step-by-step instructions for every technique he had used, how to select the right stones for different tools, how to use thermal shock to weaken granite, how to calculate water flow rates for drainage systems, how to find and identify edible plants in hostile environments. "You have created a survival manual," observed a Helian trainee who had arrived just after sunset. "Future beings could use this information to recreate everything you have done." Tom nodded while he continued working on improvements to his shelter. Even though the test would end in 2 days, he was still finding ways to make the complex better. That was the idea. Knowledge is only useful if it can be passed on to others. As night fell, Tom found himself hosting what had turned into an informal gathering of survivors. 12 of the original 19 trainees had made their way to his shelter, seeking help or just wanting to understand how he had accomplished so much. They sat around his fire pit, sharing food and stories of their struggles over the past 5 days. Crix described his attempts to phase through solid rock, only to discover that his abilities required prepared anchor points that did not exist in the natural environment. Dira explained how her metal-shaping powers were useless without refined metals to work with. The Helian told them about nearly dying when clouds blocked the sun for 2 days straight, cutting off his energy supply. Every story was the same. Advanced abilities that seemed incredibly powerful became useless when stripped of the technological infrastructure that supported them. Each species had become so specialized that they had forgotten the basic survival skills their ancestors must have possessed. "But humans remember," Tom said quietly, using one of his stone tools to carve more detailed instructions into the wall. "We never stopped needing to understand the basics, so we never forgot them." Late that night, after the others had found places to sleep in his various chambers, Tom continued working by firelight. He was putting finishing touches on his shelter's most ambitious feature. Using principles of acoustics and resonance, he had carved a signaling system into the cliff face. Tomorrow, when the rescue shuttles began looking for survivors, he would be able to create sound signals that could be heard for miles across the valley. As he worked, Tom thought about what he had learned during these 7 days. The test had not just been about survival, it had been about understanding what real strength meant. The other species had incredible abilities, but they had become dependent on those abilities. When their special powers were not enough, they had no backup. Plan humans were different. They had never been the fastest or the strongest or the most specialized, but they had always been adaptable. They had always been able to look at a problem and find a way to solve it using whatever materials were available. That flexibility That refusal to give up when the easy solutions did not work was humanity's real superpower. Tom carved the final details into his acoustic signaling system and stepped back to examine his work. In 7 days, using nothing but stones and determination, he had created a complex that could house a dozen beings comfortably and safely. More importantly, he had created a complete guide that would allow others to recreate his techniques. Tomorrow, the rescue shuttles would arrive and this test would be over. But Tom knew that what he had learned here would stay with him forever. He had rediscovered something that modern humans sometimes forgot. With enough knowledge, enough patience, and enough determination to keep trying when things seemed impossible, there was no problem that could not be solved. The sound of approaching aircraft echoed across the valley like distant thunder. Tom stood at the entrance to his carved shelter and activated the acoustic signaling system he had built into the cliff face. The resonant tones produced by his stone construction carried for miles, creating a beacon that would guide the rescue shuttles directly to his location. Around him, 11 other trainees emerged from the various chambers of his underground complex. They looked rested and well-fed, a sharp contrast to their condition when they had first arrived seeking help. Luce's crystal body was glowing brightly again, fully healed from the acid rain damage. Crix seemed stronger and more confident than Tom had ever seen him. Even Dira had regained her natural metallic luster. But the real surprise came when the first rescue shuttle landed on the narrow ledge outside Tom's shelter. Commander Vorth himself stepped out of the aircraft, followed by several other instructors, and a team of technical specialists carrying scanning equipment. Vorth looked at the carved entrance to the shelter complex, and his expression was unreadable. "Trainee Bradley, explain what I am seeing here." Tom stepped forward respectfully. "A functional survival shelter, sir. Multi-room complex with climate control, water systems, food storage, and waste management. All carved from solid granite, using primitive stone tools." One of the technical specialists was already scanning the cliff face with sophisticated instruments. "Commander, these readings are impossible. The excavation work here would require plasma cutters and molecular shapers. The precision of the water flow calculations alone suggests computer-assisted design." "Show me," Vorth commanded. Tom led the group into his shelter complex. The main chamber was warm and comfortable, lit by carefully placed fires and ventilated by the air circulation system. The walls were covered with detailed pictorial instructions showing every technique Tom had used. The carved channels that brought in fresh water and carried away waste were functioning perfectly. Vorth moved through the space slowly, examining every detail. His 6 arms gestured constantly as he pointed out features to the other instructors. When he reached the workshop area where Tom's stone tools were displayed, he stopped completely. "These were made using only other stones?" he asked, picking up one of the hand axes. "Yes, sir. The technique is called napping. You strike one stone with another at precise angles to create sharp edges and specific shapes. My species has been doing it for over 2 million years." The technical specialist who had been scanning everything looked up from his instruments with a confused expression. "Commander, every surface in this complex shows tool marks consistent with primitive stone implements. There is no evidence of advanced technology being used anywhere." Vorth continued his examination, becoming more and more silent as he discovered each new feature. The sleeping chambers with raised platforms and proper drainage. The food storage. Areas with temperature control achieved through careful ventilation design. The complete plumbing system that provided fresh water and waste removal without any mechanical pumps. When they reached the chamber where Tom had documented his construction process in detailed wall carvings, Vorth stopped again. The pictures showed step-by-step instructions for selecting stones, shaping tools, using thermal shock to weaken granite, and calculating water flow rates. It was a complete technical manual that could be used by anyone to recreate these techniques. "This is a teaching guide," Vorth observed. "Yes, sir. Knowledge is only valuable if it can be shared with others." I wanted to make sure future trainees could learn from what I discovered here. The other instructors were talking among themselves, in low voices, clearly struggling to understand what they were seeing. One of them approached Vorth with a concerned expression. "Commander, we need to discuss the implications of this. If primitive techniques can achieve these results, what does that say about our training methods?" Vorth raised one hand for silence and continued his inspection. When he had seen everything, he gathered all the trainees in the main chamber. The rescued beings stood together, but there was a clear division between those who had succeeded on their own and those who had survived only because of Tom's help. "Trainee Bradley," Vorth began, his voice carrying a tone Tom had never heard before. "In 40 years of running this program, I have never seen anything like what you have accomplished here. When I designed this final test, I intended it to be impossible. I wanted to prove that advanced species become weak when they are stripped of their technology." He gestured toward the carved walls around them. "I believed that primitive approaches would lead to primitive results. I expected you to fail, to prove that modern beings cannot survive without their sophisticated tools and abilities." Tom remained at attention, unsure how to respond. Vorth continued. "Instead, you have achieved something that our construction crews accomplish using plasma cutters and molecular shapers. You have created a living space that is more comfortable and better engineered than many modern facilities, and you did it all with stones." The commander began walking among the other trainees. "Look around you. Each of you comes from a species with remarkable abilities, natural powers that seem almost magical compared to human capabilities. Yet when you were stripped of your support systems, when your special abilities were not enough, most of you would have died without help." Crick stepped forward hesitantly. "Commander, we tried our best. Our abilities just were not suited for this environment." "Exactly," Vorth replied. "Your abilities were not suited for this environment, so you assumed the task was impossible. But the human did not assume anything. He adapted. He learned. He created solutions using whatever materials were available." Vorth returned to stand in front of Tom. "Explain to me how your species, which appears to have no special survival abilities, managed to accomplish what these advanced beings could not." Tom thought carefully before answering. "Sir, humans do have a special ability. We are generalists. We do not have the most powerful natural weapons or the most efficient energy systems or the most exotic physical properties. But we have something else. We have the ability to learn any skill that is needed and to create tools for any problem we encounter. Continue. Every other species here has amazing specialized abilities, but they have become dependent on those abilities. When the environment does not suit their specialization, they are lost. Humans never had that luxury. We had to learn to adapt to any environment, to solve any problem, to survive under any conditions. So we developed techniques that work anywhere, with any materials." One of the instructors spoke up. "But surely these primitive techniques are inferior to modern technology." Tom gestured toward the complex around them. "Are they? This shelter will last for hundreds of years without maintenance. It uses no external power sources. It requires no replacement parts. It can be built anywhere there is stone, using tools that can be made from local materials. How is that inferior?" Vorth was quiet for a long moment, processing what he had heard and seen. When he spoke again, his voice was thoughtful rather than commanding. "I have made an error," he admitted. "I have been teaching survival techniques that assume a certain level of technology will always be available. I have been preparing beings for emergencies while assuming they will always have access to their species' special abilities. But true survival means being prepared for any situation, including situations where your advantages are taken away." He looked directly at Tom. "Your species remembers what most civilizations have forgotten. You remember how to build from nothing, how to create solutions when there are no easy answers, how to survive when everything else has failed." The debriefing session that followed lasted for hours. Tom demonstrated his tool-making techniques while the instructors recorded everything. He explained the principles behind his construction methods, his water management systems, and his food preservation techniques. The technical specialists analyzed every aspect of his work, trying to understand how such sophisticated results had been achieved using primitive methods. But the most important moment came when Vorth addressed the entire group for the final time. "This program will be changed," he announced. "We will begin teaching the techniques demonstrated here, not as primitive survival skills, but as advanced adaptation methodologies. Every trainee will learn to create tools from raw materials. Every species will study human archaeological records to understand how complex civilizations can be built, from basic principles." He paused and looked around the chamber one more time. "We have learned that true strength is not about having the most powerful abilities. True strength is about being able to adapt when your normal advantages are not available. It is about finding solutions when the easy answers do not work. It is about never giving up when others would declare a problem impossible." Vorth turned to Tom with something that might have been respect in his yellow eyes. "Trainee Bradley, I am offering you a position as co-instructor at this institute. Your species has something to teach the galaxy about what real survival means." Tom smiled and nodded. "I would be honored, Commander, but I have one condition." "What condition?" "We do not teach these as human techniques. We teach them as universal principles that any species can learn. Because the real lesson here is not that humans are special. The real lesson is that anyone can learn to adapt and survive if they are willing to go back to the basics and build up from there." As the rescue shuttles prepared to return to the Institute, Tom took one last look at his carved shelter complex. In 7 days, using nothing but stones and determination, he had created something that would change how the galaxy thought about survival and adaptation. But more importantly, he had proven that true strength comes not from having the best tools, but from having the knowledge and determination to create whatever tools you need. The shuttle lifted off, carrying them back toward civilization. But Tom knew that the most important journey was just beginning. He would spend the rest of his life teaching others that no problem is impossible if you approach it with patience, knowledge, and the willingness to start with the most basic tools and work your way up to whatever solution is needed. Behind them, the carved shelter stood as a monument to human ingenuity and the power of adaptation. It would remain there for centuries, a reminder that sometimes the most advanced solution is to remember how your ancestors solved problems when they had nothing but stones and determination.